So you have a medical school interview, or you just want a better idea of what it would be like to prepare for one. Well, my name is JC. I'm a first-year medical student at the University of Toronto in Canada. And today we're going to talk about what I did to prepare for my interview, and I'll give you 5 steps on how to prepare for yours. Step 1 is to calm down. And I know you might be thinking, well, I have a medical school interview, how can I calm down? And I completely understand that, but there is a scientific basis behind this. We can take a look at why this is important using Yerkes-Dawson's law of optimal performance. At low stimulation, such as when you're bored or tired, you're going to perform at suboptimal levels. On the other hand of the spectrum, if you're feeling extremely anxious or nervous, you're also going to perform at a suboptimal level. But in the intermediate range, when you're focused but not anxious, you're going to perform at your best. So to start, the best way to approach your interview is to start becoming more comfortable with an inherently uncomfortable situation. And that brings us to step 2. Step 2 is to gather practice questions. There are 2 main types of interviews. The first is MMI, or multiple mini interviews, while the second is panel type. The type of interview that you will be doing will depend on the medical school that you're applying to and interviewing at. Some other interview styles may fall in between, such as U of T, there's an MPI interview, but really it's kind of a combination of these 2 styles. There are 3 main types of questions throughout these interviews. The first is about your personal experience or your character. The second are ethical questions. And the third are situational or behavioral questions. MMI tends to focus on situational and behavioral questions, as you will see when you go into what that interview style is like, whereas panel might be a combination of them all. Step 3 is practice. Medical school interviews typically don't only have doctors and medical professionals. There are typically other interdisciplinary individuals on that team from neighboring healthcare professions and other people from the community who may not be working in healthcare at all. This is important to think of when you're actually preparing for your interview. This means that your practice doesn't have to be only from a physician. There are many places to find practice. The first would be from your family and friends. Ask anyone who is close to you, your parents, if they have any friends, who can ask you questions from the previous list of questions that you already gathered. Since you already have the questions, all you have to ask them to do is to pick a random question from that list. Especially if you have family or friends who are in HR or who interview for any other type of position, this would be extremely valuable as they would just have interview skills in general and would be able to recreate that type of environment. Although they are your family and friends, please remind them to be as ruthless as possible and to give you feedback that maybe you could use for the interview itself. A second place that you can look for practice interview help is your university. If you are currently in an undergraduate program, many universities have what they call career centers. So at a career center, they usually do practice interviews for many different types of positions, and one of those would be medical school interviews. I personally took advantage of that opportunity at the University of Ottawa, where I did 2 practice interviews with an advisor at the career center. I thought it was extremely valuable because not only did they conduct the interview and give me feedback, but they also filmed it, so I was able to go home and see exactly how I answered those questions and critique myself thereafter as well. This may be even easier over a Zoom format, whereby you can record the Zoom practice interview if you are able to set one up with a career center. The third place to find interview practice is at the medical school itself. Low-cost interview help run by medical students. Community of support programs, for example, at U of T, where you can get matched with a medical student. And if you can't find any of these, a fourth option are prep companies. They are quite expensive, and I think most individuals can find help cheaper. But if you do have the money and you're unable or you don't want to use any of those other tips, they are available for applicants. Lastly, if you're still unsure where to find practice help, please DM me on Instagram. I can definitely try to direct you to an individual or an association where there is practice help. The thing to remember is to ask as many people as possible, try as many different styles. Honestly, the more you practice, it is just best to put yourself out in those uncomfortable situations so you become more comfortable with an interview format and setting. I remember when I was practicing for my interviews last year, I was actually at one of my best friend's birthday parties and I had her boyfriend ask me medical school questions from my list. There is always time to practice and you can make it fun if you want. You know when someone asks you what extracurriculars you do and you forget even though you're part of 25 different clubs? Well, you don't want it to be like that during the interview. The best way to get to know yourself in the context of the interview, I think, is to go through the CANMED roles. And so this is kind of specific for Canadian medical schools, but there is something called CANMEDs, and if you've never heard of it, it's basically a framework by the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. What it is are the qualities that they believe make an effective and efficient physician. They are medical expert, communicator, collaborator, leader, health advocate, scholar, and professional. This is not only the lens which medical schools typically look at your application through, it is also the lens which many medical schools look through for the interview as well. So what I did was I opened up a Google document, I put each of those CANMED roles in there, I began to list out all my extracurriculars that I thought corresponded to each CANMED role. Although you're not specifically practicing answering interview questions, at the same time you kind of are. By stratifying your entire CV based on this, if you say get a question about when you were a professional in the past in a Word document, you have all of the extracurriculars that you think corresponds to when you were a professional. This will make it easier to recall experiences on the spot during your interview, and so you'll have more time to formulate a well thought out and well presented response. Then I would go back and re-answer some of the practice questions that you had from step 2. Using this framework, you'll realize how much easier it is to answer those questions. And if you do practice after this, you might find it easier to respond to individual questions in an actual interview format. This is honestly a game changer for me. I got way more confident in answering questions because I had everything prepared and ready. One tip is don't write out complete answers when you're doing this. If you write complete answers, you may try to recall exactly what you wrote and you could sound rehearsed and you'll have a harder time trying to remember exactly what you wrote than just remembering the activity and formulating your response on the spot. Now that you're more calm, confident, you have some practice under your belt, and you have written out all of your activities and sectioned them into the different CANMED roles, you've basically done a lot of practice, and all you need to do is construct your answers in a way that will push you over the top. There are many different ways to formulate answers to interview questions, and there are a couple structures that I'll walk through right now. The first format is statement, explanation, and example. This I think I learned in elementary or high school as a way to respond to essay questions, and I think it can really work in an interview setting. So you start your response by answering specifically the question that was asked. You go on to give an explanation on why you feel that way, and then you give an example of a situation that is relevant. Obviously, this doesn't work in all cases. It really depends on the question, but it's a good framework to have in the back of your head. The second framework commonly used for MMI interviews is the SPIES framework. Each letter of SPIES stands for a different step. S stands for seeking info. So when you go into a situation, you would first try to gather all the information that you can. P stands for patient safety. So it's really important if the question has relevant patient safety issues that you can talk on to talk about that as well. I stands for initiative. So in this behavioral question, is there a way that you can do something yourself about the situation? E stands for escalate. So if you took initiative in the previous part, but you felt like in that scenario you might not be able to handle it by yourself, you should think about escalating that scenario and getting help from others. And S stands for support. So can you support the specific individual involved in that scenario? This SPIES framework may not work for all MMI questions, but it is a good way to start if you don't know how to approach them. And the last framework commonly used for ethical scenarios goes through the 4 basic ethical principles. They are beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy. If you don't know what that is, that's completely okay. I didn't know before I started prepping for my medical school interview. You can easily Google what those are. I will put a link in the description for some good resources. Many students in Canada also read the Doing Right book, which goes through these principles. I personally never read Doing Right, but many people have, and they say good things about it. So if you do have time to read Doing Right, I would recommend. Ethical questions are sometimes the hardest in many people's perspectives, so starting with these 4 main principles will help you have an approach and be more comfortable. There are many other frameworks. I'd recommend looking through as many as you can. Get comfortable with a couple of those, start incorporating them into your responses. One framework will not work for every single type of questions. Some questions may not need you to give an example, whereas some questions might be specifically ethical based. So use a framework that's best for the type of question asked. I know I said 5 steps, but the last and equally important step is to be kind to yourself. At first, you're not going to do great. You're going to stumble, you're going to get nervous, and you're not going to be at that peak optimal performance on the Yerkes-Dawson's curve. But that's okay. With practice, you will improve, you will get more comfortable in that uncomfortable situation, and using the frameworks and remembering what you've done, it will get easier and easier to answer those questions. That's the point of practice. What you want to do is improve your skills so that you make those mistakes before interview day, and on interview day you do the best that you've done in the entire length of your practice. You got an interview because they see something in you, and this is your time to show them why you want to go to medical school and why they should admit you to their school. And that's the end of the video. I hope you found this informative and helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. But otherwise, good luck on your interview.